Jane's fingers ached from gripping the steering wheel, her eyes struggling to stay open as she drove through the dimly lit streets. It had been another endless shift, one that left her body heavy and her mind barely functioning. The grocery store had been short-staffed again, which meant she had spent hours on her feet, ringing up impatient customers, lifting heavy boxes, and forcing a smile that never quite reached her tired eyes. All she wanted was to get home, peel off her shoes, and curl up next to Eli, listening to the soft rhythm of his breathing before exhaustion took her under. The streetlights flickered as she turned onto the last stretch toward her apartment. The traffic was sparse, the roads nearly empty at this late hour. She reached for the radio dial, hoping the hum of music would keep her from nodding off, but before she could find a station, something caught her eye. A pair of headlights barreling toward her from the cross street. Too fast. Too close. Her breath caught in her throat as her hands jerked the wheel, but there was nowhere to go. The sickening crunch of metal, the violent lurch of her body, and the shattering of glass swallowed everything. Then, nothing. Her consciousness drifted through a haze, weightless and untethered, as if her body had slipped away, leaving only fragments of thought behind. A ringing in her ears. A moment of stillness so absolute it felt unreal. Then came the return of sensation, a warmth that didn't belong to her small, cold apartment, the feel of soft sheets beneath her fingers instead of rough, pilling blankets. She inhaled deeply, expecting the stale air of her home, but instead, the scent of fresh linen and something faintly floral surrounded her. The air carried the crisp chill of central air conditioning, not the stubborn draft that seeped through her apartment's thin walls. Her eyelids fluttered open. The room was bathed in morning light, the sheer curtains swaying gently from a breeze she couldn't place. This wasn't her room. This wasn't her bed. Her mattress sagged in the middle, and the springs protested whenever she moved. This bed was massive, the comforter thick and plush, the pillows arranged as if someone had taken care to make the space inviting. The ceiling stretched high above her, adorned with intricate molding, and the walls were painted a soft ivory. The nightstand beside her held a sleek, modern lamp and a glass of water that had been set there with intention, as if she belonged here. Her pulse pounded in her ears as her hands flew to her body, expecting pain, bruises, some evidence of the crash, but there was none. No soreness. No bandages. Nothing to suggest she had been in an accident at all. Before she could process the impossibility of it, movement in her peripheral vision made her stiffen. A man stood at the edge of the bed, watching her with quiet concern. Dark hair tousled from sleep, eyes a striking shade of blue, his features were sharp and unmistakably elegant, as if he had stepped out of a magazine. He was dressed casually, well-fitted pajama pants, a plain white t-shirt, but there was something about him that exuded effortless wealth, the kind that wasn't just about money but about a life where everything was carefully curated, from the watch on his wrist to the way he carried himself. Before she could demand to know who he was, he leaned down and pressed a soft kiss to her forehead. "Good morning, my love." Her body went rigid. The words barely registered before sheer terror surged through her veins. She jerked away, nearly tumbling off the bed, her breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. Her hands gripped the sheets as she scrambled backward, putting as much distance between them as possible. Who are you?" Her voice came out hoarse, foreign to her own ears. The man's brow furrowed, his expression shifting from warmth to alarm. "Cecily? Are you feeling okay? Cecily?" Her heart slammed against her ribs. That wasn't her name. That wasn't even close to her name. She shook her head rapidly, her throat tightening. "My name is Jane. Where am I? What is this?" His eyes darkened with something unreadable, his stance shifting slightly as if he were trying to assess the situation. "You're at home," he said slowly, carefully, as if speaking to a frightened child. "You woke up a little late today. Do you need a doctor?" "Home." The word sent a fresh wave of panic coursing through her. This wasn't her home. Her home was a cramped apartment with peeling paint and a lock that stuck when she turned the key. Her home had a second-hand couch, a rickety kitchen table, and a 7-year-old boy who needed her. Eli. The thought hit her like a freight train, knocking the air from her lungs. Where was he? Had he been in the crash too? Was he safe? She clawed at the sheets, desperate to get up. I need to find my son. Where is he? The man, Brad, she realized distantly, from the way his name had flashed across her mind like a misplaced memory, tilted his head, studying her as if she were speaking another language. Cecily, we don't have a son. The words stole the strength from her body. Her legs wobbled as she stumbled out of bed, ignoring the dizziness that threatened to pull her back down. She darted past him, her bare feet hitting cool marble floors as she reached for the door, half expecting it to be locked, to be some kind of prison. But it wasn't. The handle turned easily, and she found herself in a hallway so vast it made her stomach lurch. She had never seen this place before. The walls were adorned with paintings, the kind that belonged in galleries, not homes. A staircase wound downward, leading to a sunlit foyer with polished floors that gleamed beneath an opulent chandelier. None of it made sense. Brad was behind her in an instant, his hands hovering as if unsure whether to reach for her. Cecily, what's going on? You're scaring me. She whirled around, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Stop calling me that. I don't know who you are. I don't know what this place is. I don't. Her voice broke as a realization hit her like ice down her spine. How do I look? His confusion deepened. What? Where's a mirror? Her voice was sharp, frantic. He hesitated before stepping aside, motioning toward a gilded mirror on the far wall. She barely registered the way her hands trembled as she stepped toward it. The woman staring back at her was almost familiar. Almost. The shape of her face was the same, but the details were wrong. Subtle changes, fuller lips, softer features, hair that was too perfectly styled. It was her, but it wasn't. Jane's stomach clenched. She pressed her hands to her reflection, as if she could push through the glass and find her real self on the other side. Behind her, Brad's voice softened. You're acting like you don't know me. She turned to him slowly, her heartbeat hammering in her chest. I don't. Jane shoved the blankets off and stumbled out of bed, her legs shaky beneath her. The plush carpet underfoot did nothing to ground her. Every inch of her body screamed that she did not belong here. The man in front of her, the one who had kissed her forehead like they had woken up together every day for years, watched her with a mixture of concern and confusion. Cecily? Brad's voice was careful, as if he were speaking to someone fragile. What's wrong? Jane pressed her hands against her temples, willing herself to wake up from whatever this was. Who are you? She demanded, her voice raw with fear. Where am I? Brad took a hesitant step toward her, his expression tightening. Cecily, what are you talking about? You're at home. She backed away so fast that she nearly tripped over the edge of a sleek, modern armchair positioned near the bed. Home? No. Home was a tiny apartment with a leaky faucet and a too-small couch that doubled as a bed when her son had nightmares. Home was the smell of peanut butter sandwiches and Eli's sneakers tossed in the corner. This place, this cavernous, impossibly perfect space, wasn't hers. Her chest heaved as she turned in frantic circles, trying to make sense of her surroundings. She caught sight of herself in a mirror across the room and froze. The woman staring back was her. But not exactly. Her hands flew to her face, fingertips grazing features that were familiar yet foreign. Her lips looked fuller. Her skin, impossibly smooth, like she'd just come from an expensive spa treatment she could never afford. Even her hair, silky, without the usual frizz she wrestled with every morning, was different. She leaned in, eyes scanning over details that were hers but not hers. Brad watched her carefully. "Cecily, you're scaring me." She tore her gaze from the mirror and looked at him. "Stop calling me that." His brows pulled together. "Calling you what?" She swallowed hard. "My name is Jane." For a long moment, Brad just stared at her. "Cecily," he said slowly, like he was explaining something obvious to a child. "This isn't funny. If you're not feeling well, we should call a doctor." Her head shook so violently that it made her dizzy. "No. I don't need a doctor. I need to know what's happening." Brad exhaled and ran a hand through his already tousled dark hair. "Maybe you had a nightmare," he suggested. "A bad one." She didn't know how to explain that this entire life, was the nightmare. Her breathing grew erratic, panic pressing against her ribs, threatening to spill over. She needed to get out of this room. Out of this house. Back to Eli. The thought of him shot through her like an electric current. "I have to find my son." The words tumbled out before she could stop them. Brad blinked. "What?" "My son." Her voice pitched higher, more desperate. "Eli. He's 7. He has a freckle right above his eyebrow and he loses every sock he owns." "Where is he?" Brad's expression shifted from confusion to something closer to alarm. "Cecily, we don't have a son." The world tilted beneath her. Her arms wrapped around her stomach as if she could hold herself together, as if her body wasn't about to crack open from the weight of those words. Brad didn't know Eli. No one in this house knew Eli. But he was real. He was her everything. He had to be here. She turned, bolting toward the door, her bare feet sliding slightly on the polished floors. She yanked it open, stepping into a hallway so pristine it made her stomach lurch. The walls were painted a soft, expensive cream, and the chandelier hanging from the ceiling looked like something out of a magazine she once flipped through while waiting for a job interview she hadn't gotten. She had no idea where she was going, but her body moved anyway. Down the hall, peering into rooms that were all too perfect and yet completely unfamiliar. A sitting room, a study, another bedroom, each one pristine, elegant, and utterly wrong. Brad followed, his steps quick but careful. "Cecily, slow down." She ignored him, taking the stairs 2 at a time, her breath coming fast and sharp. Her mind raced through possibilities. Maybe this was a dream. Maybe she had hit her head harder than she thought, and this was some kind of post-trauma hallucination. Maybe. A woman appeared at the bottom of the staircase, holding a silver tray with a neatly folded linen napkin. She looked to be in her 50s, dressed in a crisp black and white uniform, and had the kind of composed expression that suggested nothing surprised her. Jane nearly tripped trying to get to her. "Where's my son?" The woman's brows lifted, but she didn't falter. "I'm sorry, ma'am." "Eli," Jane gasped, her heart pounding in her throat. "My son. He's 7. He's probably wondering where I am. Please, just tell me where he is." The maid's gaze flickered briefly to Brad, who had reached the bottom of the stairs, a deep frown etching into his face. When she looked back at Jane, her expression softened just a fraction. "Mrs. Blackwell, Jane's entire body recoiled. "What did you just call me?" The maid hesitated, her carefully composed demeanor cracking just slightly. "Mrs. Blackwell." The words sank into Jane's bones, chilling her from the inside out. She turned back to Brad. "Blackwell?" His jaw tightened. "Cecily Blackwell." His voice was firm, like he was trying to anchor her. "My wife." A strangled sound left her throat. No, that's not possible. Brad ran a hand over his face, exhaling like he was trying to be patient. This is our home. You are my wife. Cecily. Everything inside her rejected the words. This wasn't her home. This wasn't her life. And Brad, whoever he was, wasn't her husband. She spun back to the maid. Listen to me, she pleaded, her voice shaking. I don't know what's happening, but my name is Jane Malloway. I have a son named Eli. He's my whole world. I need to find him. The maid's face remained neutral, but her eyes flickered with something, pity, maybe. Like she was watching someone unravel in real time. Jane pressed a hand to her forehead, willing the room to stop spinning. Please, she whispered. Just tell me where he is. Brad stepped closer, his voice soft but firm. Cecily, you're scaring everyone. She turned to him, desperation clawing at her throat. I am not Cecily. His jaw tightened. Yes, you are. Her breathing hitched, chest rising and falling in uneven bursts. None of this made sense. Everything in her gut told her she wasn't crazy. But the way Brad looked at her, the way the maid studied her with barely concealed concern, what if she was? What if this was real? What if Eli wasn't? A sharp knock echoed through the mansion, cutting through the tense silence between Jane and Brad. He hesitated, eyes still filled with confusion and concern, but then he turned toward the door, rubbing his temples like a man who had been dealing with too much too early in the day. Stay here, he said, though it didn't sound like an order. More like a request. Maybe even a plea. Jane wasn't planning on listening. The moment he stepped out, she darted toward the massive window, hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever had arrived. A sleek black car sat in the driveway, polished to perfection. The woman stepping out of it had an air of someone who expected the world to accommodate her. She wore confidence like armor, her blonde hair in a sleek chignon, her tailored coat cinched at the waist like it had been designed specifically for her. Brad opened the door, and she swept past him with the kind of authority that suggested she'd done it many times before. He barely had a chance to close it before she was shrugging off her coat and tossing it at a waiting staff member, her gaze already scanning the space. Where is she? Jane didn't have to hear Brad's reply. She knew exactly who the woman was talking about. Seconds later, Brad reappeared in the doorway of the bedroom, his face a mix of hesitation and resignation. Lucille's here. Of course she was. Before Jane could figure out how to brace herself for whatever this was about to be, Lucille swept in, her heels clicking against the floor in a way that felt deliberately menacing. She stopped just short of Jane, her sharp blue eyes raking over her like she was inspecting a piece of fruit at the market and finding it lacking. You look terrible, she said flatly. Jane blinked. Excuse me? Lucille crossed her arms. Your hair's a mess, you're pale, and you're looking at me like you don't even know who I am. She didn't. But saying that wasn't going to do her any favors. Brad sighed. Lucille, not now. Lucille ignored him entirely. What's wrong with you? Jane's hands clenched at her sides. I was in an accident. Lucille's gaze narrowed. So I heard. But you don't have amnesia, do you? She was too sharp. Too calculating. It felt like every movement Jane made, every breath she took, was being catalogued and analyzed. Of course not, Jane lied, because the truth was something even she couldn't explain. Lucille tilted her head, eyes never leaving Jane's face. Then what's my middle name? Jane's stomach dropped. Brad groaned. Lucille, don't do this. Lucille barely glanced at him. It's a simple question. If she doesn't have amnesia, she should be able to answer it. Jane swallowed. There was no way out of this. No lucky guess that could save her. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Brad shifted uncomfortably. Cecily, just. Cecily. Lucille's voice was ice. That's interesting. Because she doesn't look like Cecily. She doesn't sound like Cecily. Brad shot her a warning look, but Jane could tell. Lucille wasn't going to let this go. Say something, Lucille pressed. Anything Cecily would say. Jane was drowning. She could feel it. This wasn't just suspicion, this was a woman who had always been waiting for Cecily to make a mistake. Brad sighed. She's recovering. She's disoriented. Give her a break. Lucille exhaled slowly, but the fire in her eyes didn't dim. Fine, she said smoothly. I'll play along. For now. But Jane knew. The game had already started. She waited until Lucille and Brad disappeared downstairs before she moved. She had to figure out who Cecily was, what her life had been, and fast. The mansion was impossibly large, a maze of hallways and perfectly curated rooms. She pressed her hand against doors, carefully pushing them open and peering inside. Most of them were guest rooms, each more extravagant than the last. Then she found it. A study. Mahogany shelves lined with books she had never heard of, framed certificates from Ivy League schools, and a desk so polished it reflected the chandelier above. But what caught her attention was the album sitting on the coffee table. She hesitated before reaching for it. Her fingers trembled as she flipped the cover open. Photographs stared back at her. Wedding photographs. Brad stood beside her, beside Cecily, smiling in a tuxedo, looking like he had stepped straight out of a romance novel. The woman next to him was wearing a wedding dress that probably cost more than Jane's rent for a year. The woman was her. Not exactly. But close enough. Her breath hitched as she flipped through the pages. There were images of them cutting the cake, dancing under golden lights, kissing as guests cheered around them. It was undeniable. This had happened. This was real. And yet, she remembered none of it. No aisle. No vows. No moment of looking at Brad with love. She snapped the album shut and pressed her palms against her face. Lucille was right about one thing. She wasn't Cecily. She just didn't know how to prove it. Jane waited until the house settled into the quiet hum of late evening, the kind that stretched between dinner and sleep when people were too distracted by their own routines to notice anything unusual. She had spent the past few hours pretending. Smiling when necessary. Nodding at conversations she barely registered. Keeping Lucille at arm's length, though she could feel the woman watching her, always watching. Brad had been gentler, more patient, but even he was walking on eggshells, his eyes clouded with concern every time he looked at her. She had to figure this out. She slipped out of bed and padded down the hallway, careful to keep her footsteps light. The mansion felt even larger at night, the towering ceiling stretching endlessly above her, the gleam of polished wood and marble catching the dim glow of security lights. The office was locked. Of course it was. Her fingers hesitated over the doorknob before she turned and pressed herself against the wall, exhaling slowly. There had to be another way in. She traced the hallway with her hands, peering through slightly open doors until she found one that led to a smaller sitting room. A connecting door sat in the corner, slightly ajar. She slipped inside. The office smelled like expensive leather and aged paper, like power and history pressed into the very fabric of the room. The bookshelves were lined with thick, heavy volumes, most of them legal and business-related, titles she had never heard of and wouldn't pretend to understand. The massive desk sat at the center of the room, pristine, the kind of order that suggested a man who had control over every aspect of his life. Her fingers moved quickly, opening drawers, flipping through files. There were financial statements, legal documents, property deeds. All evidence of a life she was supposedly living but had no memory of. Then she found it. A slim leather folder, tucked neatly beneath a stack of paperwork. She pulled it out and flipped it open, her breath catching as her eyes scanned the documents inside. Cecily Blackwell. The ID was crisp, the kind that didn't see the inside of a wallet too often. Her own face, her not quite right face, stared back at her, the glossy surface reflecting the dim light. The birth certificate confirmed the same name, the same details. Place of birth. Date of birth. Her date of birth. Her stomach lurched, fingers tightening around the edges of the paper as if she could squeeze sense out of it. It wasn't possible. She wasn't Cecily Blackwell. She was Jane Malloway. Single mother. Grocery store employee. Habitual late payer of electric bills. A woman who had struggled and fought for everything she had, who had never owned a dress as expensive as the one hanging in the closet she had woken up to that morning. But according to this, she had always been Cecily. A choked sound left her throat. The walls felt like they were closing in, the edges of her vision tunneling as her breath turned shallow. She needed air. She staggered backward, nearly knocking over the chair behind her. The phone. She needed a phone. Her phone. She grabbed the sleek device from the desk, the kind she had only ever seen in commercials, and punched in the only number that mattered. Eli. The call didn't go through. No ring. No voicemail. She tried again. Disconnected. Her fingers trembled as she dialed her own number, the one she had had for years, the one stored in school records, job applications, and overdue bill statements. Nothing. Her throat constricted, her pulse hammering against her skin. This couldn't be real. This wasn't real. Her knees buckled before she could stop them. The floor rushed toward her, her vision swimming in and out of darkness as the weight of everything pressed down, crushing, suffocating. Then, nothing. When she woke, she wasn't on the floor anymore. Warmth surrounded her, the comforting scent of something familiar yet foreign, cologne, clean linen, something deeper, something safe. Arms around her. She blinked, disoriented, her body sluggish and heavy. The soft glow of a bedside lamp cast golden light across the room, and the faint sound of breathing near her ear made her stomach tighten. Brad. She was in bed, but she wasn't alone. His arms were wrapped around her, holding her against his chest, his breath slow and steady against her temple. "You scared me," he murmured, his voice thick with something raw, something unguarded. "I found you on the floor." "I thought," he exhaled shakily, his hold tightening. "I don't know what I thought." She stayed still, her pulse roaring in her ears, her mind struggling to catch up. Brad wasn't Lucille. He wasn't looking at her with suspicion or waiting for her to slip up. He wasn't calculating or guarded. He was just a man holding his wife, in the aftermath of something that had shaken him. Jane should have pulled away. She should have forced herself upright, should have shoved him back and demanded answers. But she didn't. His hand moved slowly, fingertips tracing gentle patterns against her back, the touch grounding her in a way she hadn't expected. She had spent so long fighting, clawing her way through life, carrying the weight of everything on her own. And here was a man who was simply holding her. The worst part? It felt good. Wrong. But good. Brad pressed a soft kiss against her hair, his lips lingering there for a second longer than necessary. "I love you," he whispered, his voice low, intimate. "Whatever this is, whatever's happening, I'll fix it. I promise." Her throat ached. She wasn't Cecily. She wasn't his wife. But he didn't know that. And for a brief, fleeting moment, she let herself pretend. Jane stood in front of the floor-length mirror, adjusting the diamond earrings that had been carefully placed in her hands by a woman whose name she still hadn't learned. Everything about her reflection was wrong. The gown clinging to her body was the kind of dress meant to be admired, shimmering under the warm glow of the vanity lights. Her hair was swept back into soft waves, her makeup flawless, her lips painted a deep red that screamed wealth, power, confidence. None of which she felt. Brad had barely let her out of his sight since she had collapsed in his office. He hovered just enough to make sure she was okay, but not enough to suffocate her. And every time she met his gaze, she saw it, the love, the devotion, the absolute certainty that she was his wife. So she did the only thing she could think of. She played along. She let him take her hand as they walked down the grand staircase, let him press a kiss against her cheek as they stepped into the waiting town car. She listened as he spoke softly to her about the evening ahead, about how she didn't have to stay long if she wasn't feeling up to it. She smiled. She nodded. And inside, she memorized every detail. The gala was held at a private estate just outside the city, a mansion that somehow managed to be even grander than the one she was currently living in. The moment they arrived, the doors were pulled open by staff who greeted them with deference, their names known without introductions. Jane kept her expression smooth, her posture straight. She had watched enough movies to know how to pretend she belonged in a world she had never set foot in before. Brad's hand rested gently on her back as they entered the ballroom, the space glittering with chandeliers and the kind of wealth that made her stomach twist. Guests turned their heads in their direction, polite smiles and murmured greetings rippling through the crowd. She had no idea who any of them were. Cecily, darling. The sound of Lucille's voice sent a chill down her spine before she even saw her. She turned, meeting the sharp gaze of the woman who had been watching her like a hawk since she had woken up in this life. Lucille's smile was all teeth, her eyes scanning Jane's face like she was searching for something. "You look lovely tonight." Jane returned the smile, keeping her voice steady. "Thank you." Lucille didn't move. "How are you feeling?" Brad shifted beside her. "She's doing much better." Jane nodded. "Much better." Lucille's gaze lingered, a flicker of something unreadable passing through her expression. "I was beginning to think you were avoiding me." Jane's fingers curled around the stem of the champagne flute that had been placed in her hand. "Why would I do that?" Lucille tilted her head slightly. "I don't know. Maybe because of the last conversation we had before your accident." Her heart slammed against her ribs. She kept her face neutral. "What conversation?" Lucille's smile sharpened. "The one where you told me you were leaving Brad." The world shifted under Jane's feet. She forced herself to keep her breathing steady, to take a slow sip of champagne like the words hadn't just sent a shock through her entire body. Brad glanced between them, frowning. "What are you talking about?" Lucille didn't take her eyes off Jane. "She didn't tell you?" She let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. "Of course she didn't." Jane swallowed, her mind racing. She had nothing. No memories to pull from. No knowledge of what Cecily had been planning, what had led her to that car the night of the accident. So she did what she had been doing since she woke up. She played along. "I don't remember," she said, her voice careful. "I don't remember any of it." Lucille studied her, something calculating in her expression. "Convenient." Brad's hand tightened on Jane's waist. "Lucille, enough." Lucille exhaled slowly, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Of course," she said smoothly. "I'm sure it's nothing." But her gaze told Jane she wasn't going to let it go. She excused herself the moment Lucille walked away, murmuring something about fresh air before slipping past the clusters of guests, her heart pounding. She moved toward the terrace, needing a moment to process what she had just learned. Cecily had been planning to leave Brad. Before the accident. Before everything. Why? The cool night air did little to steady her racing thoughts. She gripped the railing, inhaling deeply, trying to piece together something, anything, that made sense. A voice cut through the noise of her mind. I know what happened to you. She stiffened. The man stood a few feet away, his face partially obscured by the shadows. He wasn't dressed like the other guests. His suit was less polished, his tie slightly loosened, like he had been dragged here from another world entirely. Her pulse thrummed. What? His eyes met hers, dark and serious. Not here, he murmured. They're watching. Her breath caught in her throat. She turned her head just slightly, just enough to catch a glimpse of Lucille in the ballroom, her sharp gaze still trained on her. Jane looked back at the stranger. And then she followed him into the night. Jane's hands clenched at her sides, her heart hammering against her ribs as she stared back at Lucille. The sharp click of her heels against the stone path sent a slow, deliberate warning through the night air. There was no escaping this. Jude was already retreating. She barely caught the movement in her periphery, the way his body tensed before he turned sharply, vanishing into the shadows like he had never been there at all. Coward. Jane wanted to call after him, demand he stay and explain everything, but the weight of Lucille's presence pinned her in place. I see you're making new friends, Lucille murmured, her voice smooth as glass. Jane forced herself to breathe, to keep her posture straight even though she wanted nothing more than to shrink under the woman's razor-sharp gaze. She forced a tight-lipped smile. I stepped out for some air. Lucille hummed, tilting her head slightly. And instead, you found yourself deep in conversation with a man I'm quite certain isn't on the guest list. Jane's pulse stuttered. Of course Lucille knew. Of course she had noticed every detail, every misplaced moment, every interaction that didn't fit the carefully curated world she so clearly controlled. Lucille took another step closer, the light catching the edges of her ice blue dress, the diamonds at her throat. There was something almost amused in her expression, though it was laced with something much sharper. I'll admit, Cecily, you're getting bolder. Jane swallowed, careful not to react too quickly. What's that supposed to mean? Lucille let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. Please. Do you think I don't know what you were doing? Jane forced herself to hold her ground. I was. You were talking to him, Lucille interrupted smoothly, her voice dipping lower, almost conspiratorial. Again. The word sent a spike of dread through Jane's chest. Again. So Lucille knew about Jude. Or at least, Cecily's relationship with him. Jane schooled her expression, trying to keep her breathing even. I don't know what you're talking about. Lucille smiled, but there was no warmth behind it. Oh, don't insult me. Jane felt her pulse in her throat. I should be impressed, honestly, Lucille continued, ignoring her. You barely had to lift a finger to trap my brother, and now you're trying to play both sides. It's almost admirable. Jane's hands curled into fists. I'm not. But the act is slipping, Lucille cut her off again, her tone cooling. You've been different since the accident. Jane's skin prickled. Lucille narrowed her eyes slightly. Brad doesn't want to see it, of course. He never does when it comes to you. But me? She smiled again, sharp and knowing. I see everything. Jane forced herself to hold her gaze, even though the urge to run was curling in her gut. I don't know what you think you know, she said slowly, carefully. Lucille's smirk widened just a fraction. That's the thing, Cecily. I don't think, I know. Jane's throat tightened. Lucille leaned in slightly, her voice dipping into something just above a whisper. You were leaving him. The word sent a shock through her system. Jane felt the world tilt, the memory of Jude's voice echoing in her head. You were going to leave Brad. Lucille's gaze didn't waver. That's what this is, isn't it? That's why you're so off. Jane didn't answer. She couldn't. Because Lucille was waiting for it, for the slip, the stammer, the giveaway that she was right. Jane forced herself to breathe, to settle her expression into something unreadable. I don't remember anything before the accident, she said evenly. Lucille exhaled a quiet laugh, shaking her head. How convenient. Jane turned away, making a move to leave, but Lucille's hand shot out, grasping her wrist. I should warn you, she murmured, her voice dangerously soft. Jane hesitated. Lucille's fingers tightened ever so slightly. You may have Brad fooled, she said, but I'm not so easy. Jane met her gaze, steady but unreadable. Lucille studied her for a long moment before finally letting go. Don't push your luck, Cecily. Then she turned on her heel, gliding back toward the party with perfect composure, leaving Jane standing alone in the dark. Her breath came in shallow bursts as she tried to process everything. Cecily had been leaving. Cecily had been hiding money. Jude had been her secret. And now, Lucille knew something was wrong. Jane's fingers trembled slightly as she wrapped her arms around herself, the weight of it all pressing down. Whatever this was, whatever had happened to Cecily before the accident, it wasn't just about a marriage falling apart. It was something much, much bigger. The storm had been coming for days. Jane could feel it in the way Lucille's eyes tracked her, in the careful way Brad spoke to her, in the growing weight pressing down on her chest. The world around her had become a house of cards, and Lucille was the wind waiting to knock it all down. It happened in the dining room. The long mahogany table was set with gleaming silverware and crystal glasses, the soft hum of conversation filling the air. Brad sat at the head, his fingers absent-mindedly circling the rim of his wine glass. Jane sat beside him, trying to look like she belonged there. Lucille chose her moment perfectly. She placed her napkin down, slow and deliberate, before looking straight at Brad. I wasn't going to say anything, she said, her voice smooth, almost bored. But it's getting pathetic, really. How much longer are we going to pretend nothing is wrong? Brad frowned. Lucille. She's lying to you, Lucille said, turning her gaze to Jane. And not just about one thing. Jane's stomach twisted. Lucille tilted her head, enjoying this. I have to admit, Cecily, you've been putting on quite the show. The wide eyes, the lost little act, it's almost believable. But we both know the truth, don't we? Brad's fingers tightened around his glass. Lucille, enough. Lucille ignored him. You should have left when you had the chance, she continued. Isn't that what you were planning? Before the accident? She let the words settle, let them sink in. Then, with a slow, cruel smile, she delivered the final blow. Does he know about Jude? Brad stilled. The name dropped into the room like a stone into deep water. Jane swallowed hard. Brad turned to her, his blue eyes searching her face. What is she talking about? Lucille's smirk grew sharper. Oh, you don't know? That's interesting. She leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on the table. She was going to leave you, Brad. She was sleeping with Jude, planning her escape. She even had millions tucked away, just waiting for the right moment. Jane felt the blood drain from her face. Brad let out a quiet laugh, one of disbelief. That's ridiculous. Is it? Lucille arched a brow. You can ask her. Every set of eyes in the room turned to Jane. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Brad shook his head. Tell her she's wrong. Jane's throat was dry. Lucille let out a soft sigh. Go on. Say it. Jane opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She didn't know how to fix this. She didn't have the memories, the proof, the right words. Lucille had backed her into a corner, and the walls were closing in. Brad's jaw clenched. Tell me she's lying, Cecily. She wanted to. She wanted to say something, anything, that would make it all disappear. But she wasn't Cecily. And Cecily had been planning to leave. Cecily had been hiding money. Cecily had been with Jude. Jane wasn't sure what was worse, the fact that Lucille had just torn her life apart in front of everyone, or the fact that she didn't have a single way to fight back. Brad pushed back from the table. The chair scraped loudly against the floor as he stood. His face was unreadable. Get out. Jane felt the air leave her lungs. She stared at him, waiting for him to say something else, waiting for this to be a misunderstanding. But he just turned away. Lucille's smirk was victorious. The staff was already moving, stepping in like silent shadows, waiting to escort her out. She couldn't fight. She couldn't explain. So she left. The doors slammed shut behind her, and suddenly, she was alone. The cold night air bit at her skin as she stepped off the estate, her heels clicking against the pavement. She walked aimlessly, the weight of everything pressing down on her. Brad was gone. Eli was gone. She had nowhere to go. Her steps slowed as she reached an empty intersection, the glow of streetlights flickering above her. She squeezed her eyes shut, pressing her fingers against her temples, willing the memories to come. And then it hit her. A sharp, blinding flash behind her eyes. The rain had been coming down hard that night. The windshield wipers worked furiously, but it wasn't enough. The road was slick, the headlights too dim. Someone was in the passenger seat. Not Brad. Not Jude. Cecily. Jane gasped, the memory slamming into her with full force. Cecily had been with her. In the car. She wasn't supposed to be there. But she had been. And then, the crash. The world spun as the realization settled deep in her bones. Everything she thought she knew was wrong. Because Cecily hadn't just been in the car with her. She had been the one driving. Jane had never felt time stretch so unbearably thin. Every second, every breath, felt like it existed outside of reality, suspended between what she had believed to be true and what she now knew was a lie. The memory of the crash had cracked something open inside her, flooding her with fragments of a life she had never lived. Cecily had been there. In the passenger seat. Alive. And then, she wasn't. She didn't know how it had happened. But she knew who might. Jude. Her fingers trembled as she pressed his number into the phone, stolen from Brad's office before she had been thrown out. The device felt foreign in her hands, sleek and unfamiliar, a reminder that even the smallest details of her existence had changed. The phone rang twice before he answered. A pause. Then. I told you not to call me. Jane clutched the edge of the table where she sat, her pulse roaring in her ears. The small cafe she had chosen was dimly lit and nearly empty, the kind of place where people met when they didn't want to be seen. The smell of stale coffee and burnt toast filled the air, the hum of an old refrigerator buzzing somewhere behind the counter. We need to talk, she said. Jude exhaled, the sound sharp and impatient. I don't think so. I remember the accident. Silence. Jane tightened her grip on the phone. Cecily was in the car with me. Another pause, longer this time. Where are you? She gave him the address, her fingers tapping restlessly against the table as she waited. Every shadow felt longer, every glance from the lone barista behind the counter heavier. When Jude finally walked in, he scanned the room quickly before making his way over. He didn't sit right away. He stood for a moment, studying her like she was something he wasn't quite sure existed. Then, finally, he slid into the seat across from her. Jane didn't waste time. Cecily was in the passenger seat, she said, her voice low. She didn't survive, did she? Jude's jaw tensed. She leaned forward. Why didn't anyone say anything? Jude rubbed a hand over his face, looking suddenly exhausted. Because no one knew. Jane's stomach twisted. He met her eyes, his gaze steady. You were found alone, Jane. She shook her head. That's not possible. Jude exhaled sharply. They pulled one body from the wreckage. Her breath hitched. His fingers drummed against the table. Do you believe in impossible things? She swallowed hard. Why? Jude hesitated. Then. Because you shouldn't be sitting here. The word sent a cold shiver through her. She sat frozen, her pulse thudding painfully in her chest as Jude leaned in. I don't know how it happened, he said, voice barely above a whisper. But I know what it means. She wanted to tell him he was wrong. That there was a logical explanation for all of this. But there wasn't. Jude sat back, watching her. You're in her body. Jane felt the air leave her lungs. Jude let out a sharp laugh, though there was nothing amused about it. I thought you were playing a game, he admitted. Pretending you didn't remember me. Pretending you didn't know the plan. She barely heard him. Jude shook his head. But you're not Cecily, are you? The words settled like a weight on her chest. She forced herself to focus. What plan? Jude hesitated, his fingers still tapping restlessly. Then, finally. She was leaving. Jane swallowed hard. She was running, Jude continued. Not just from Brad. From Lucille. The name sent a fresh wave of unease through her. Jane forced her voice to stay steady. Why would Lucille care if Cecily left? Jude scoffed. Because Cecily wasn't supposed to marry Brad. She frowned. What? Jude exhaled. It was a deal. The families. The money. The power. But Cecily never wanted it. Jane's thoughts spun. She was supposed to marry someone else, Jude continued. Lucille's fiancé. Jane's stomach dropped. Jude's voice was grim. It was supposed to be them. That was the plan. That's what would have kept the Blackwell name where it needed to be. But then Brad got involved. Jane's pulse pounded. She didn't love him, Jude continued. She didn't love any of them. But she hated Lucille. A flicker of something crossed his face. And what better way to ruin her than to take what was supposed to be hers? The pieces were falling into place too fast, the puzzle forming a picture she wasn't ready to see. Lucille didn't just hate her, Jane whispered. Jude nodded. She wanted her gone. The words sent ice down Jane's spine. She forced herself to breathe. You think she had something to do with the accident? Jude didn't hesitate. I know she did. The walls felt too close, the air too thick. Jude exhaled. Cecily had money, Jane. Millions. She was planning to disappear. But she was running out of time. Jane's pulse thundered in her ears. And then she got in my car. Jude was quiet. Jane pressed her hands against her temples, trying to make sense of it all. Lucille had been watching her from the moment she woke up in this life. Had she known? Jude's voice cut through her thoughts. You need to be careful. Jane swallowed hard. Jude's eyes were serious. Lucille doesn't lose. If she thinks you know something, if she thinks you're digging too deep, He exhaled sharply. You need to get out. Jane's stomach twisted. Jude stood. I shouldn't have come here. Jane grabbed his wrist. Jude. But he was already pulling away. I can't protect you, he said quietly. And I don't think anyone else can either. Then he was gone. Jane sat frozen, the weight of everything settling in. Cecily had been running. Lucille had wanted her gone. And now? Jane wasn't sure who was in danger. Cecily. Or her. Jane had never hated a doorbell more. She stood outside Brad's estate, heart pounding, fingers hovering over the button she had already pressed twice. The mansion loomed above her, its windows glowing with warm light, mocking her with the illusion of home. She had lived here, Cecily had, but now, standing on the outside, it felt like she was trespassing on someone else's life. She wasn't supposed to be here. But she had no choice. Footsteps echoed inside. A shadow passed over the glass before the door swung open. Brad. His face was unreadable, but something in his eyes flickered, anger, confusion, maybe even hope. You shouldn't be here, he said. Jane swallowed hard. I know. He exhaled, gripping the doorframe like he was stopping himself from doing something reckless, like pulling her inside or slamming the door in her face. You lied to me, he said. Jane's throat tightened. I didn't. I tried to tell you, but you wouldn't believe me. Brad's jaw clenched. Lucille told me everything. A sharp laugh escaped her. Lucille told you exactly what she wanted you to hear. Brad's lips parted, but before he could speak, another voice rang out. Oh, for God's sake, Brad, why is she here? Jane didn't need to turn around to know Lucille had appeared in the hallway, her irritation wrapped in carefully manufactured concern. She was in silk again, perfectly pressed, not a hair out of place. The kind of woman who would bury a body and show up to brunch the next morning in pearls. I need to talk to Brad, Jane said, forcing her voice to stay even. Lucille crossed her arms. Oh, honey, you've done enough talking, don't you think? She turned to Brad. You promised me she was out of our lives. Jane ignored her, locking eyes with Brad. You told me you loved me, she said. You begged me to remember. Well, I do. His brows drew together, hesitation flickering across his face. Lucille scoffed. Oh, please. She's making it up. Jane took a step closer. You once told me you hated the smell of gardenias, but I wore that perfume anyway just to get a reaction out of you. Brad froze. You pretended not to care, Jane continued, voice shaking. But later that night, you bought a different perfume and left it on my dresser without saying a word. Lucille's face hardened. Brad stared at her, something unraveling inside him. Cecily never told anyone that. Jane pressed forward. And do you remember the night before our wedding? You came into my room, drunk, scared, and told me that if I wanted to run, you'd let me. Her voice broke. Because you knew I didn't love you. Brad paled. Lucille stepped between them, her presence crackling with barely contained fury. This is ridiculous. Brad ignored her, eyes locked on Jane. How do you know that? He whispered. Jane's pulse roared. Because I am Cecily. Lucille let out a sharp laugh, but it sounded forced. Oh, come on. She's playing with you. Brad's gaze didn't waver. Jane took a shaky breath. Cecily was leaving. She had the money, the plan, everything. And you want to know why? She turned to Lucille. Because she found out about you. Lucille stilled. Brad frowned. What are you talking about? Jane turned to him, feeling the weight of the truth pressing against her ribs. Lucille didn't just hate Cecily, she said. She was framing her. Brad stiffened. Lucille let out a dry chuckle. Oh, please. This is pathetic. Jane's hands curled into fists. Cecily had money hidden away, she said. Jude told me. She wasn't just running from you, she was terrified of Lucille. And now I know why. She reached into her coat pocket, pulling out the flash drive Jude had slipped her before disappearing. She had spent the last 24 hours combing through everything, the proof buried under layers of false transactions and forged signatures. She held it out. Here, she said. Brad hesitated. Lucille's face finally cracked. Brad, don't. Jane didn't take her eyes off him. This proves everything. The money Cecily had? Lucille made sure it looked like she stole it. Every transfer. Every account. She was setting her up, Brad. Brad's hand hovered over the flash drive. Lucille took a step closer. Brad, she's lying. Jane's voice was razor sharp. Then let him see for himself. Lucille's expression flickered, panic, anger, calculation. And Brad saw it. He grabbed the flash drive, turned on his heel, and stormed toward his office. Lucille lunged after him. Brad. He slammed the door in her face. Silence. Jane turned to Lucille. You should start worrying. Lucille's fingers twitched at her sides. For the first time, she looked afraid. Jane smiled. It wasn't over yet. But it would be soon. Jane's world was crumbling. Brad stood in front of her, the man who had once looked at her with such devotion now searching her face for answers he couldn't possibly comprehend. She had told him everything. The accident. The truth about Cecily. How she had woken up in a life that didn't belong to her. And still, he hadn't pushed her away. Brad had been pacing for what felt like hours, raking a hand through his hair, his mind working through the impossibility of it all. His sharp, unreadable expression was the only thing keeping Jane from breaking apart completely. Finally, he stopped. Turned to her. I should call a doctor, he murmured. Jane let out a sharp, exhausted laugh. You think I'm crazy? Brad hesitated, like he was weighing the question carefully. I think you believe what you're saying. Her heart ached at his measured response. Brad. He held up a hand. You're asking me to believe that the woman I've spent years with, the woman I married, the woman He cut himself off, his jaw tightening. You're telling me she's gone. Jane swallowed hard. She is. Brad let out a sharp breath, his hands clenching into fists before he exhaled, forcing himself to calm down. Then he took a slow step forward. If that's true, he said quietly, then who are you? Jane's throat went dry. Who was she now? The answer should have been simple. She was Jane Malloway. A single mother. A woman who had worked dead-end jobs, who had struggled every day to make ends meet, who had lived a life so far removed from this one that it should have felt like a distant dream. But it didn't. Somewhere along the way, this life had become hers. Brad stepped closer, his voice softer now, more hesitant. I don't know how to explain it, but when you woke up after the accident, you were different. Jane's breath caught. Brad ran a hand over his face, like he was exhausted just trying to make sense of it all. I kept telling myself it was trauma, that maybe you just needed time to remember. But every day, I looked at you, and something in my gut knew. He shook his head. You weren't her. Jane blinked, her chest tightening. Brad let out a broken laugh. And the worst part? His voice dropped, and he looked at her like she was the only thing keeping him upright. I fell in love with you anyway. The words knocked the air from her lungs. Brad stepped even closer, close enough that she could feel his warmth, close enough that she could see the way his eyes searched hers for some kind of answer. "You're not Cecily," he said softly. "I know that now. But that doesn't change the fact that his voice caught. That I want you." Jane's heart pounded so violently it hurt. Brad took her hands in his fingers warm and steady. "Tell me to let you go," he whispered. "And I will." She couldn't. She couldn't. Everything in her was screaming that this wasn't her life, that she didn't belong here, that she had a son waiting for her in another world. But the way Brad looked at her, it made her want to stay. Her lips parted. And then the world tilted. Everything went dark. She was falling. And then nothing. Jane gasped awake, her body jerking violently. The air around her was sterile, cold. The harsh fluorescent lights of a hospital room burned her eyes, and the steady beeping of a heart monitor filled the silence. Her chest rose and fell in ragged breaths. This wasn't Brad's house. This wasn't Cecily's world. This was hers. Her real world. A small hand clutched hers tightly. "Mom?" Jane turned her head so fast it made her dizzy. "Eli." Her little boy sat beside her bed, his wide, tear-filled eyes staring up at her like she might disappear again. His tiny fingers clutched hers, warm and familiar and real. A sob tore through her chest. "Eli." Eli's face crumpled, and he let out a shaky breath. "You scared me." Jane blinked rapidly, barely able to process anything beyond the sheer relief of seeing him. She squeezed his tiny fingers. "I'm here, baby." Eli sniffed, wiping his nose on his sleeve before gripping her hand even tighter. "You were asleep for a long time." Jane swallowed hard. "How long?" The door creaked open, and a nurse stepped inside, offering a gentle smile. "Welcome back, Ms. Malloway." Jane forced herself to breathe. "How long?" she asked again, her voice raw. The nurse checked her chart. "You were in an accident 3 days ago. You suffered a head injury, but we were able to stabilize you." 3 days. 3 days. Her heart pounded, her mind spinning. It hadn't been weeks. It hadn't been months. It had been days. Then how had it felt so real? Her fingers twitched against the sheets, and she felt something crumpled in her palm. Frowning, she slowly uncurled her fingers. A note. Her breath hitched as she smoothed out the small, delicate piece of paper. Just 4 words. "I remember you. Brad." Jane's heart slammed against her ribs. She stared at the note, her fingers trembling, her mind screaming that it wasn't possible. But deep down, something in her whispered that maybe, just maybe, it was.